Hi there and welcome. We just got back from filming a ton of content for our new habitat exploration series, and the last video we posted was all about this beautiful plant, Astecium reiteri. So if you haven't seen those yet, I highly suggest you check that out after this video. If you're watching this, you most likely found them very fascinating and amazing. Just to see these things in context and where they evolved and out in habitat is just a whole nother, I guess, side to this hobby, other than obviously keeping them in cultivation, which is also amazing on its own right. But on this video, we're going to be talking about watering your cacti and succulents, and more specifically, top watering. Because on the internet, you'll see lots of people sort of taking sides and going with either technique. You know, you can water these from the top, or you can soak the pots and bottom water them. And I personally believe that both of these systems work great in tandem, as opposed to just picking one and sticking to it. I think using one versus the other, depending on the situation, is very helpful to these plants. So we're going to be talking about when I like to use top watering as opposed to bottom watering and why I like to do it. So let's start off by saying that we're assuming that you're only going to be watering your plants during their growth season. You never want to water your cacti and succulents when, well, most of your cacti are probably going to be summer growers, so you won't want to water those in the winter, and you won't want to water winter growers in the summer. So it might be a little confusing at first. I don't personally have any winter growing plants. All my cacti and succulents are summer growers, which basically means they only grow and they're only active during the summertime and the spring when it's warm out. And the reason for that is, you can imagine these plants sort of evolved in habitats where their environments are very extreme. So during the winter, the days are shorter, and so they have less solar exposure to take advantage of to do photosynthesis. So for that reason, out in habitat, they've evolved to stay active and grow only during the months when it's hottest, because those are the times when the days are longer. So they have a lot more solar exposure to take advantage of and do photosynthesis to carry out their growth cycles. So assuming that you're only watering your plants when they're active, there's reasons to use top watering versus bottom watering when, for example, your root systems need to remain active and stimulated so that they don't go into desiccation. Because what happens is, when these plants experience extended periods of drought or extreme drought, their root systems go into a slight desiccation. They sort of pause their growth. They go into this suspended growth, and they almost go into dormancy, because if they were to be in habitat where they evolved, when they experience those extended periods of drought, well, they know that they're not going to be receiving any constant rain. So for that reason, they suspend their growth and they sort of wait until they receive a little more moisture to sort of begin their growth cycles again. So for that reason, I think it's important to differentiate between top watering and bottom watering and sort of talk about their strengths and weaknesses and compare them to one another a little bit. So I personally I prefer to use top watering in the fall when your root systems are not as active, and also in the springtime on the first water event of the growth season. You can imagine that when these plants are coming out of their winter dormancy, their root systems are not as active yet. They're just starting to come out of dormancy, and for that reason, you don't want to give them too much work. You don't want to give them too much water and too much moisture to uptake, because they're just not fully awake yet, and you could cause root rot by giving them too much moisture before they're able to absorb it. So during the fall, I like to top water. The first watering of the season, I also don't like to fertilize or give any insecticides on that first watering of the year, for the same reason. The root systems are just not as efficient and not as active yet to be given too much work. So that's the reason, or the main reason, why I think both of these techniques sort of complement each other. Instead of picking one over the other, I think there's different scenarios where you would want to top water or you want to bottom water, depending on the situation. When you bottom water, you sort of dunk the pots inside of a bigger container and you thoroughly saturate the soil, which means especially if you're using a mostly inorganic or all inorganic soil mixture like the ones you can find on our website, which I'm hoping you are, because they are just superior and way better for these plants than all organic or mostly organic soil mixes, then all you have are particles of highly porous surfaces, right? That is just a fancy word for basically particles that have a lot of pores. And just like a sponge, when you have a highly porous surface, you need that entire surface to be enveloped by water or moisture for them to be able to uptake that moisture. So you can imagine that when you top water, unless you sit there with the hose for an extended period of time and wait until you fully saturate the entirety of the soil, then dunking the pot is always going to be more efficient, because you can imagine that every single particle inside of your pot will be enveloped by moisture in a shorter amount of time. And you can tell, because when you dunk a pot inside of a bigger container, you sort of see bubbles coming up to the surface, and that's basically all the little pockets of air that each of these porous surfaces has is becoming saturated like a sponge. It's uptaking all that moisture. So for that reason, I believe that bottom watering is best suited for times when your plants need more moisture than those times when they maybe need a little bit less. So I like to top water when the root systems are not as active, just to keep them going and keep them from going into dormancy. And I like to use bottom watering when they need a lot of moisture, when they're actively growing, or for example, when a plant hasn't been watered in a very long time. Another good example of when it's advantageous to use top watering is when you freshly pot a cactus. I don't personally like to water them right away, but if you choose to water them right away, hopefully in the warmer season, because with warmer temperatures you sort of stay away from root rot a little bit more, because the heat also helps the plant evaporate. So even if the roots are not able to absorb all the moisture right away, then the heat will also help it evaporate that extra moisture, so that it's not sitting in any wetness, or it's sitting in water, because potted cacti definitely don't like to sit in any sort of wetness or water or moisture. Out in habitat, it's not uncommon to see these plants sort of sit in wet soil for 2, 3, and 4 days, or even receive multiple rain events in a single week. But you can imagine that out in habitat, when they're in the ground, these plants have a lot more space to spread out their root systems. And also they have the presence of bugs. And believe it or not, bugs in habitat are constantly aerating the soil. They dig holes and furrows into the ground, and that also helps sort of give a little extra oxygen to the root systems and give them a little added aeration and ventilation, if you will, and that keeps them from rotting out in the field. Not to say that you don't see instances of rot out in the field, you certainly do, but it's a lot less, or it occurs a lot less than it does in potted plants, simply because they have a lot more space to spread out their roots, and also they have other plants sitting around them that also help uptake some of that moisture, so they're not sitting in wetness for too long. Those are just some of the situations or some instances in which I will choose top watering over bottom watering. But at home, I know some people, or a lot of people, prefer to always top water. And not to say that that's incorrect. You can definitely always top water your plants, and depending on the soil and depending on sort of the formula in your soil, you could definitely get away with that. If you have a little more organic content in your soil, maybe that organic content is able to absorb just a little less moisture and hold it in around the roots for longer. So you might get away with always top watering, or you may always bottom water your plants, which is also definitely okay. It all depends on a bunch of factors, including your own environment, the sort of soil you like to use. So I think the main takeaway here is that there's no one perfect way of doing things. It all depends on how your plants are potted and where you live and how your environment interacts with your plants. Also, the amount of solar exposure plays a huge role in how long these things take to evaporate and absorb moisture out of the pots. Sometimes people ask me how often they should be watering their cacti indoors, and unfortunately I don't like to give advice on growing indoors because I just don't have any working experience. I only tried growing indoors very briefly when I first started collecting, and I did run into a lot of problems. So for that reason, I changed my method 100%, and now I only grow my plants outdoors. And I also have fans running all day, which also helps aerate not only the crowns and keep everything sort of fresh, but also it adds to the evaporation effect of the sun. These plants receive about 8 to 10 hours of sunlight per day, and that's sort of the optimal range. If you can achieve 10 or more hours of sunlight per day, even better. But all those factors play a role in how fast your pots are going to evaporate, and all those things are going to sort of play a role in the learning curve of how often you should be watering your plants and which method you should use. So top watering your plants has a couple of caveats that I want to talk about. When I do top water my plants, I always try to avoid wetting the crowns, and the reason for that is I live in South Florida, where it's extremely humid, and any standing moisture on the crowns can lead to fungal infections of the skin. So when I do top water, there are two things I want to mention. I always do it in the morning time because I count on the sunlight and my fans to help the evaporation. If I do manage to get some moisture on the crowns of my plants, I want them to evaporate, or I want that moisture gone as soon as possible, because it can definitely lead to fungal infections of the skin. And another caveat or another interesting thing is that cacti and succulents live on the CAM system, which is a cruciulian acid metabolism. And that's basically a big term that explains a phenomenon which sort of describes the way these plants absorb moisture, and that is only at nighttime. If you can imagine, these things live out in the desert where it's extremely hot. So these plants take advantage of the nighttime when there's not as much evaporation going on and when there's not as much heat to absorb moisture. And the reason for that is, in order to absorb moisture, these plants need to open up their pores or their stomata. And whenever they open up their pores, not only are they able to absorb moisture, but they also lose some moisture in the exchange. So for that reason, it's more efficient for them to uptake moisture only at nighttime. So you always want to water your plants either very early in the morning or late in the afternoons after sunset, because they only uptake moisture at nighttime. And also because if you water when the sunlight is hitting the crowns of the plants and you by accident leave some moisture on their skin, that moisture can act sort of as a magnifying glass. I don't know if you've ever played with a magnifying glass in the sun, but if the sunlight gets very focused in one point, it can lead to sunburns of the skin of your plants. So you never want any moisture on them when the sun is hitting them very strongly. So for that reason, it's also advantageous, or it's advisable to water them when they're not being hit by the sun. So early mornings or late afternoons are the best times to water your cacti. And I personally like to top water in the morning because I count on the sun, like I said, and the fans to help with that evaporation if I do manage to get some moisture on their crowns. And on the opposite, or on the flip side, I like to bottom water or dunk my plants in the evenings, because let's assume that you're only bottom watering your plants when they do need a lot of moisture, when they're dehydrated or when they haven't been watered in a long time. So you want them to be able to have the entire night to absorb as much moisture as possible before they're hit by the sun again in the daytime, because that sun will evaporate some of the moisture. So there's just different scenarios and different little caveats that you have to sort of take into consideration when you're choosing which method you want to use to water your plants. But there's no one way to skin a cat. There's just different methods of doing things, and you definitely don't have to pick one over the other. You can just try different things and then see what works best for you. But personally, I think both of these methods are great, and depending on your situation, one may work better than the other, or like in my case, you may want to use one over the other depending on the time of year, the time of the day that you're watering, and many other different factors that are going to come into play when it's time to help the evaporation process of your plants. Like always, I hope that this video is helpful. I hope that I answered some of your questions regarding your watering techniques, and if you have any other extra questions, of course leave them down in the comment section. If you're interested in seeing how I like to bottom water, I'm definitely going to make a video on that come springtime, because temperatures are starting to dip now here in South Florida, and even though we don't really experience a very harsh winter, it only goes our temperature only drops to about maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe a little bit lower than that. I still like to give my plants a couple of months of winter dormancy because it helps with the flowering the next season. If you keep your plants growing throughout the year and you give them water throughout the year, I have read that it can stunt their flower production just a little bit the following year. And I like to grow my plants as hard as possible, which means I give them the least amount of water possible. So I like to leave them alone during the winter and sort of give them a couple of months to rest. One more thing I'd like to mention is that there are plants that like to go dormant during the summer, during the two hottest months of the summer. That is the case of Ariocarpus and also Copiapoa. And these plants do need a little bit of moisture during these times, but not too much because they're not 100% active. So during those times, I will also use top watering, just a little lighter than I would when they're actively growing or when it's the fall that they actually do need moisture. But I will use the top watering method because I know that that leaves a little less moisture in the mix than bottom watering or dunking your plants. You can imagine that when you dunk your plants, the entirety of the soil gets completely saturated by moisture, and if the root systems are not actively uptaking that moisture, well, that can lead to instantaneous death. You know, root rot is a pain in the ass, and it can definitely happen even in the middle of the summer, because some of these plants do also go dormant during those two hottest months of the year. So I hope this helps some of you guys keep these beautiful plants alive, and as always, catch you on the next video. Drop any comments down in the comment section or any questions. And if you haven't caught our habitat exploration series, the last video we posted was about this beautiful plant, Asticium reiteri. Make sure you check that out. I'm sure you guys are gonna love it, and look out for the next following videos we'll be posting on the coming weeks, because we caught some amazing, beautiful cacti out in the field. Some of them were even blooming, and you're gonna love them. I mean, I was just blown away, and I'm sure a lot of you will be too. So catch you on the next one.